Returning from an event at his old school LSU, Shaq stopped to fill up at an old gas station on the outskirts of Baton Rouge. But he never expected to run into Arthur again, the kind station owner who had once let poor college student Shaq buy food on credit back in 1991. And Shaq was stunned to discover that his old benefactor was on the verge of bankruptcy. A ruthless rival corporation had stolen 60% of Arthur's revenue and pushed him to the breaking point. But Arthur was a proud man. He hid his struggles and flatly refused any direct financial help from the millionaire superstar. This conflict forced Shaq into a journey full of challenges. He had to stand up against a powerful enemy, race against a bank foreclosure deadline, and find a way to help without wounding his old benefactor's pride. Would Shaq accept defeat in the face of a harsh reality? And what impossible plan was about to shake the entire town? The sound of clinking glasses rang through the grand hall of the LSU alumni event. Camera flashes popped one after another, aimed straight at the tired face of the giant man standing in the middle of it all. The wealthy crowd pressed in around him. They wanted autographs. They pitched cold business deals. The whole thing felt hollow. Fame can be a very lonely place. They saw him as a walking ATM that night. Nothing more. A fat businessman slapped him hard on the shoulder, pitching a new construction project. The smell of expensive cologne mixed with strong liquor made the air in the hall feel thick and close. Shaq was exhausted. He gave polite nods and forced smiles to keep the peace. His chest tightened when he realized nobody in that room actually cared how he was doing. They only wanted to use his name and his money to make more of their own. Wealth can be deeply lonely. The luxury perfume and cigar smoke in that LSU hall was suffocating. Guests in expensive suits pulled him toward photos he did not want to take. They laughed and made small talk, while their eyes stayed locked on his fame the whole time. He felt trapped. An investment fund director stepped into his path and pushed a business card into his hand. The man talked about a real estate project in Houston with big promised returns. Shaq gave a quiet shake of his head and walked past him looking for a way out. All they saw was money. Loneliness settled over the giant man even in the middle of hundreds of cheering people. He understood that championship rings and gold medals had not brought him happiness. They had only turned him into a display piece for the wealthy to admire. He needed to escape. Memories from his poor days in Newark hit him without warning. Back then, his mother Lucille had worked herself to the bone until midnight just to earn enough. Life was hard, but it was full of real love. Not this. He missed those days. While the crowd was busy toasting each other, Shaq quietly slipped through an emergency exit. His 7-foot, one frame had to bend low to clear the steel bar above the door. He moved fast across the dark parking lot behind the building. The noise stopped. He walked quickly down the dark hallway, his dress shoes clicking against the stone floor. He pushed the exit door open hard and stepped into the cool night air. The stillness of the night wrapped around his tired body. He breathed out. He climbed into the rented black SUV, already idling quietly in the shadows. His big hands quickly loosened the silk tie that had been choking him all night. Shaq rolled the window down a little and let the warm Louisiana air flow into the cabin. He pressed the gas. The car pulled out of the university grounds and pointed straight toward the quiet stretch of Highway 61. The American South at night had a strange stillness to it. Old pine trees stood dense and motionless along the road. The tires rolled steadily over the rough, graveled asphalt. All the noise was gone. Inside the dark cabin, Shaq felt the familiar physical discomfort of a 325-pound body in a car built for normal people. His size, 23 shoes were cramped under the dash, but he would take that discomfort any day in exchange for a few hours of freedom. He just wanted to drive. He drove without any destination or map in mind. The misty bayous of Baton Rouge appeared soft and blurred beyond the fogged window. The breeze carried the smell of damp earth and dry pine, and it cooled the heat building in his head. His mind slowly settled. Then the dashboard let out a sharp beep that broke the quiet. A yellow fuel pump icon blinked steadily, warning him he had maybe 3 miles left in the tank. Shaq exhaled slowly and scanned the dark, empty road around him. The tank was almost dry. Up ahead, A weak neon sign flickered at an old roadside gas station. A rusted tin sign swung in the night breeze, making a slow, creaking sound. Shaq turned the wheel and pulled the SUV into the gravel lot around the station. The car stopped. Shaq pushed the door open and stepped out into the heavy, humid heat that hit the top of his head immediately. The smell of old grease and gasoline hung thick in the air around the poor little stop. The concrete under his feet was stained dark with old dried motor oil. The place was falling apart. The wooden door of the station stood barely 6 feet tall, forcing Shaq to bend painfully low. A small brass bell above the door gave one dry click and went silent. Tiny dust particles danced in the slice of light coming through the cracked front window. Inside, it was very quiet. Behind the worn plywood counter, an older man stood bent over something. He had short white hair and a deeply lined face darkened by years of sun. He wore a faded LSU windbreaker from the 90s. That man was Walter. Walter looked up at the giant, who had just walked in. His old eyes squinted under the light. He stepped back one small step when he recognized the face standing across from him. The memory of a young broke college student from 1991 came rushing back. Walter said his name softly. Shaq stood still, looking at his old friend, seeing how much the man had aged in 30 years. Back then, Walter had quietly let the young Shaq buy food on credit, without being asked. Those warm meals had kept him going through the hardest stretches of those early years. The debt ran deep. Shaq stepped closer to the wooden counter, bending down a little, so the space between them felt less wide. Walter lifted his thin, wrinkled hand and patted the big, solid arm of the man standing before him. The old man smiled a toothless smile and asked his old student how life had treated him. Shaq smiled back. Walter used an old worn cloth to wipe a grease smear off the plywood counter. His shaky hands made the cloth slide off the dusty edge of the surface. Shaq reached out quickly with one large hand and caught the cloth before it fell. Walter smiled with quiet gratitude. The old man thought back to those cold days of 1991. The awkward 19-year-old Shaq, tall and unsure of himself, always hovering at the edge of the station. The boy never had enough money for food, but Walter had always called him inside. Walter had let him run a tab. Walter said quietly that he always knew that boy would become a star known around the world. He had followed every one of Shaq's games on his old black-and-white TV in the corner. But he had never once planned to use that old kindness to ask for anything in return. His pride was too great for that. Walter pointed to a photo of Shaq from his college days, hung with care on the red brick wall of the station. The photo had faded with time, but had been wiped clean and kept carefully. It was the one spiritual treasure that had helped the old man through the hard and lonely days. He treasured it deeply, but the warmth of that reunion faded fast when Shaq noticed the empty shelves all around the room. Dust covered every iron rack. Not a single box of crackers or carton of milk remained. On the counter sat a document stamped in bright red from the local bank. It was a foreclosure notice. The paper listed a land tax debt of $14,218.50, long overdue. If not paid by Monday, the bank would seize the entire Delta fuel station. Walter would lose the only thing keeping him and his sick wife afloat. Everything looked hopeless. Walter quickly grabbed a stack of old files and covered the debt notice, not wanting anyone to see it. He waved his hand lightly and said it was just a small old age problem, nothing to worry about. But Shaq could clearly see the deep exhaustion hiding behind the old man's gentle smile. The old man was beaten down. Shaq looked out through the window toward the gleaming gas station across the highway. The Vanguard Energy Superstation blazed with green neon lights and rows of modern pumps. They had used dirty tactics to quietly drain away every last one of Walter's customers. The pressure had been ruthless. Sterling, the arrogant regional manager of Vanguard, had bribed local officials to change the road layout. They had blocked the left turn lane leading into Walter's station, making it nearly impossible for drivers to pull in. Delta's revenue had fallen 60% in less than a year. It was a perfect trap. Shaq felt a surge of anger rise up when he saw the injustice crushing a good man. Without hesitating, He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. He told Walter he wanted to pay off the full debt right now. All of it. Walter's face went cold. The old man used his thin hand to push the check firmly back across the counter. His voice shook with offense as he said he did not need charity from anyone. He had worked for himself his entire life and had never once begged for a handout. His pride could not be bought. Walter said in a rough voice that Shaq should pay for his gas and leave. He did not want the good relationship they had built over the years to be stained by petty money. The directness of the old man landed like a bucket of cold water. Shaq went completely still. Walter stared at the number on the check with steady, cold eyes. He shook his head slowly and said that an old soldier never surrenders to hard times. He wanted to face his own problems himself until his last breath. He would not owe anyone. Shaq looked deep into the firm eyes of his old friend and felt something ache in his chest. He understood that pushing Walter to take the money would break something between them. That could never be fixed. The dignity of a working man was not something you could buy. It was priceless. He gave Walter a quiet nod and walked back out into the cool, dark night. The bayou wind came in off the marsh carrying cold, damp air from the Louisiana flatlands. Shaq stood beside the SUV, his wide chest rising and falling as he worked through everything. He was not giving up. He stood still for 3 seconds under the flickering fluorescent light of the old worn-down station. The words of his stepfather, Sergeant Philip Harrison, came back clearly from his childhood. Do not be a reaction, be a response. He understood that handing over cash directly would damage the old man's dignity beyond repair. He had to hold himself back. Shaq carefully put the check back into his jacket pocket and gave the station owner one last nod. He walked slowly across the wooden porch, the gravel under his heels making a lonely sound. The heavy Louisiana night heat pressed down on his head as he moved toward the car. He got in the SUV. The black rental sat idling quietly in the shadows at the edge of the road. Shaq rested his forehead against the steering wheel and felt the full weight of having money, but no way to use it. He had $400 million and could not help the man who had once fed him when he had nothing. Money felt useless. The crickets buzzed in the cactus brush along the highway, slow and sad. Shaq looked across the road at the rival station blazing, with traffic and light. The arrogance of that big corporation was swallowing working people whole. He could not just sit there. He opened his phone and quietly typed an urgent message to his lead attorney. He asked for a full review of all land and zoning records connected to Vanguard Energy right away. A quiet legal battle was about to begin. The response had started. A plan to go up against Vanguard Energy began to take shape inside the giant man's mind. He knew he was racing the clock because the bank deadline was only 2 days away. How do you save an old man's gas station without hurting his pride in the process? The fight was beginning. The creak of the wooden door broke the tense silence of the room. A middle-aged man in a worn work uniform walked in with a slow, heavy step. His face was darkened by the dust and grease of long hauling runs. That was Roy. Roy was a loyal truck driver who had filled up at Delta Fuel for 30 years without fail. He walked slowly to Walter's counter and set down an old glass jar clouded with dust. Inside it were coins and a few crumpled dollar bills. The coins clinked softly. Roy said quietly that this was everything he had put together to pay for his oil. He had just come off a long, hard haul through the southern bayous below Baton Rouge. The rival station across the road was cheaper. But he had never once thought about switching. Loyalty meant everything to him. Walter took the jar with his thin, shaking hands. He opened the lid carefully and counted every single coin with steady attention. Roy watched Walter and exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting toward the empty shelves. His heart was heavy. Roy turned and looked at Shaq, the big man sitting quietly in the shadows of the corner. He did not know who was hiding under that low-pulled cap, but he felt something warm coming off this large, quiet stranger. Roy gave him a small nod. Roy spoke to Shaq in the low, rough voice that working people from the bayou carry. He said that Walter's station was the heart and soul of this whole area. This place had taken care of more struggling families than anyone could count through every storm season that had come through. Walter was a good man. Roy's loyalty and quiet pride hit Shaq hard. He sat still and listened to every plain word the man spoke. The words of his stepfather, Sergeant Philip Harrison, came back again. Do not let good people fall. His stepfather had always told him that real strength means standing up for the people who helped you. A real man does not turn his back when someone who showed him kindness is hurting. Shaq tightened his fist. A fire lit up in his chest. He was staying. Roy paid up and walked back out to the porch, fired up his old lumber truck, and let it rumble. The engine growled once and rolled slowly out onto the highway. Shaq watched the truck disappear behind a wall of old pines, feeling something deep rise in him. Real pride is beautiful. Shaq slipped quietly off the porch, climbed into the black SUV, and drove. He turned off onto a rough side road leading to a motel along Highway 61. The Pines Motel smelled like damp pine wood and had a ceiling fan that squeaked with every turn. He rented a small room. The narrow room forced Shaq to duck under the old wooden ceiling beam. He sat down on a creaky spring mattress beside a foggy window. He flipped open his laptop and set up a temporary command post. He called his lawyer. Caleb, the sharp lead attorney of Shaq's company, picked up immediately from his office. His calm, steady voice through the phone speakers signaled a long working night ahead. Shaq told Caleb to pull every land and financial record tied to Vanguard Energy right away. Caleb promised to dig in. He needed to understand why Walter's debt had climbed to $27,000. Every transaction between the local bank and Vanguard Energy had to be traced and explained. Shaq did not want to hand Walter cash directly. Walter would never accept it. He needed hard evidence. He pressed his fingers against both temples, trying to push back the ache building there. The fake glow of the LSU event earlier that evening felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Right now, he was just a poor kid from Newark trying to protect the man who had once protected him. His mind was set. Caleb sent through a secure file containing the full traffic and zoning map. The map showed that the boundary lines of Delta's property had been illegally moved. Vanguard Energy was behind the whole scheme. They wanted to swallow Delta Fuel whole. The fraud was clear. They had bribed a zoning employee to shift the road divider eastward. This move had turned Walter's left turn lane into a no-entry zone, completely cutting off his traffic. The whole thing had been carefully planned 6 months earlier. It was ruthless. Shaq gripped the edge of the desk, his wide chest tight, with anger at what had been done to a decent man. He told Caleb to prepare an emergency legal filing for Louisiana State Court. This case was going to be the blow that brought Vanguard down. He would see it through. Pale moonlight came through the gap in the wooden window frame and threw a shadow of the giant man across the brick wall. Late-night Louisiana brought cool marsh air drifting into the room. Shaq closed his eyes and steadied himself for what the morning would bring. Everything was ready. Sunday morning. Harsh sunlight beat straight down onto the gravel yard of Delta Fuel. Shaq came back to the station in his gray hoodie pulled low over his face. He bent himself onto an old wooden bench on the porch and watched quietly. An expensive car pulled up. A polished black Cadillac stopped hard at the mossy front step of the station. Sterling stepped out in a clean gray suit and a look of pure arrogance on his face. He was the regional director of the massive and wealthy Vanguard Energy Corporation. He walked in like he owned the place. Sterling tapped his alligator leather briefcase on Walter's rotting counter. He threw down a buyout offer with an insultingly low number on the page. He said loudly that Delta Fuel had less than 24 hours. Walter was about to lose everything. Sterling used sharp, mocking words to cut at the poverty and worn-down state of the station. He told Walter to sign the paper quickly and take the small amount being offered before it got worse. Walter's thin shoulders trembled with the effort of holding himself together under the humiliation. The old man stayed silent. Sterling spotted Shaq standing in the dark corner and threw out a sneer. He called him a useless big guy standing around playing guard dog at a broken-down gas station. The class arrogance of a man who thinks money makes him untouchable came pouring out. Sterling laughed loudly. Shaq stood like a rock, his eyes quiet and still behind dark glasses. His chest pushed with anger, but he held the 3-second silence. The respond-don't-react philosophy kept every violent impulse locked down. Sterling was not worth it. Then Miss Clara walked in. A 72-year-old apple pie baker, a little hard of hearing, carrying a basket of warm pastries that smelled of rich butter. She was one of Delta's most loyal longtime friends. She stepped in to shield Walter. Clara raised her voice and told Sterling to take his dirty paperwork and get out. She said the people of this town would never let anyone take this station away. Her small, fierce presence made Sterling visibly uncomfortable. He sneered and looked away. Roy, the truck driver, had just parked and stepped down, moving to stand beside the porch. His broad frame and sharp eyes made Sterling's crew take a half step back. They were not going to get rough in front of people like this. The solidarity was strong. Sterling snatched his alligator briefcase back and walked fast to the Cadillac. He snapped that the bank would be here at 9 Monday morning to enforce the seizure. The sleek car roared away and left a trail of burned rubber and dust. He was sure he would win. Walter sighed and stepped out to the porch to sit beside Shaq, holding his old worn LSU cap in both hands. He thanked Roy and Miss Clara for standing with him, but his eyes were still heavy knowing the deadline was closing in fast. He did not know what to do. Shaq looked at his old friend and gently placed one large hand on the thin, frail shoulders beside him. He said quietly that justice always finds a way to beat dirty tricks. His eyes stayed fixed on the rusty Delta fuel sign swinging in the cold breeze. Hope was starting to form. Roy pulled an old plastic chair next to Shaq and sat down slowly on the porch. He began talking about the years when floods had wiped out the Bayou region. When the whole town went dark, Walter's station had been the only place that stayed open to help. Walter gave out free bread. He had used every barrel of reserve fuel to run a generator for the people in the area. He had not taken a single dollar from any struggling family. Roy said this place had never just sold fuel. It had sold human warmth. It was a symbol of the town. Shaq sat in silence and listened, feeling something deep fill his chest. He understood now exactly why the poor people of this area loved Walter the way they did. Giving back what was given to you is one of the most human things there is. He was more determined than ever. Back in the cramped motel room, the keyboard clicked steadily through the long night. Shaq and Caleb worked side by side comparing old land survey maps and zoning records. They found that a key signature on a zoning document had been forged. It was a fraud from the start. The boundary had been deliberately shifted east to cut into public road space. This move had turned Walter's left-turn access directly into a restricted lane. The scheme had been quietly set up 6 months before the station began bleeding customers. They were clever about it. Shaq picked up his phone and called the county bank director directly. He used his influence to request a full review of the foreclosure paperwork. The bank director panicked and promised to re-examine every transaction tied to the account. The other side was starting to sweat. Miss Clara set a warm apple pie on the small round table between them. The smell of cinnamon and rich butter spread through the poor little room. She said through tears that her own bakery had just been forced to close. Vanguard had crushed her too. They had tripled the rent on her spot in the town center 3 months in a row. She could not keep up with the cost and had no choice but to leave. Delta Fuel was the only place that still let her sell her pies each week. She was deeply grateful to Walter. Shaq looked at the warm apple pie and felt an idea land. He smiled quietly and told Clara her baking was something special. The combination of Clara's pies and his brand name could be the lifeline they needed. The plan was taking shape. The Baton Rouge night sky above was full of faint stars blurred by mist. Wind off the bayou carried the hum of the rival station across the road. The decisive battle set for Monday morning was being prepared with great care. Vanguard was about to fall. A late summer storm rolled in suddenly and covered the Baton Rouge sky in dark clouds. Heavy rain hammered down on the rusted tin roof of Delta Station. Thunder cracked and rolled through the old pine groves one after another. Everything felt heavy and dark. Inside the old station, Walter quietly packed up files and ledger books. His shaking old hands pressed strips of tape over a torn cardboard box. He was slowly putting away the last pieces of a working life. The old man was preparing to leave. Cold wind pushed through the cracked door frame, pulling damp marsh air into the room. The broken ceiling fan sat motionless under the pale, flickering fluorescent light. The smell of old fuel and dusty paper pressed together into something suffocating. The room smelled of grief. Walter reached up and wiped the mix of sweat and tears from his cheek. He looked around the empty station and felt a helplessness he had no words for. 30 years of building something from nothing was about to be taken by dirty hands. The injustice was a physical pain. At that same moment in the motel room, Shaq received an urgent call from Caleb. The lead attorney reported they had finished pulling together the full body of evidence. The legal documents clearly showed serious misconduct by the zoning official. Vanguard had forged the paperwork. They had paid exactly $50,000 to move the road divider. The left-turn access had been blocked illegally 6 months prior, and the $27,345 debt had been manufactured through pressure. The scheme was airtight on their end. The bank's foreclosure deadline was now exactly 12 hours away. At 9 Monday morning, the enforcement crew would arrive at Delta Fuel. Shaq gripped the phone, his eyes steady and clear. He had his plan ready. Caleb sent over one more file, a detailed technical analysis of the highway zoning. Vanguard Energy had fabricated a traffic survey report. They claimed the left-turn lane into Delta was a safety risk to passing vehicles. But it was a lie. The real data showed the traffic density at that turn was completely safe. There had not been a single accident recorded at that stretch of road. Sterling had paid to silence the state traffic inspector who had done the original study. They were deeply corrupt. Shaq felt the full ugliness of what rich and powerful people do to crush those with less. They wanted Walter's land only to expand their parking lot. He was going to take every piece of this to the state investigators. They would pay for it. The rusted wall clock ticked slowly toward 8 in the evening on Sunday. Shaq pushed the wooden door open and stepped into the dark, unlit station. Walter was sitting alone in the corner on a cracked plastic chair with no lights on. He had not turned the lights on. Shaq said nothing. He walked quietly to where the old station owner sat. His knees creaked as he lowered his 7-foot-1 frame. He sat down on the cold concrete floor beside the empty shelves. He sat right beside Walter. Walter flinched and turned to look at the large shadow that had just settled beside him. The old man sighed and asked why the boy was not back at the hotel resting. Shaq turned and looked at Walter with quiet, steady eyes full of real feeling. He wanted to be here. Shaq asked softly whether Walter remembered the cold winter of 1991. Back then, the broke young Shaq had come in here many times on an empty stomach. Walter had smiled and let him take home boxes of lunch meat and bread on credit. That old debt still mattered. Walter let a warm smile open across his face. His tired old eyes lit up with real pride. He remembered the huge, goofy kid who always cleaned out everything on the shelf. Walter said helping Shaq back then had been one of the true joys of his life. He never regretted a single day of it. But the smile dropped fast, and a quiet sob caught in his throat. Walter dropped his head into his wrinkled hands and cried in silence in the dark room. The pain of losing the station he had spent his whole life building had finally broken through. The old man had nothing left to hold on to. He choked out that he had no idea how to face tomorrow. Vanguard was too strong. They had money and power and influence on every side. Walter felt the shame of being unable to protect his own home. His pride had taken a real wound. Shaq sat in silence watching his old friend cry and felt his own chest ache with it. He did not reach for hollow comfort words or easy sympathy. He remembered what his stepfather Philip had taught him about protecting someone's self-respect. 3 seconds of silence passed. Walter leaned his head back against the old red brick wall of the station. He talked about the days when Shaq would come in worn out after long practices. Back then the young giant usually had exactly $1 in his pocket, but he was always hungry. Walter had made him thick handmade sandwiches with whatever meat he had. He always told the boy to eat first and settle up later whenever he could. Walter had seen that Shaq was poor, but had a truly good heart underneath all that size. Shaq had always helped clean up around the place too. Shaq smiled quietly, remembering the taste of those sandwiches. They were the best food he had ever eaten in his life. The kindness Walter had shown him back then had planted something in him that never left. He had never forgotten it. Walter said through a tight voice that this station was his family's legacy. His father had built it from the ground up in the early 50s. He could not stand the thought of bulldozers flattening it for a parking lot. This place carried his father's soul. Tears fell onto the front of the old man's worn LSU windbreaker. Shaq lifted one large hand and patted Walter's back gently. The silence between two men who fully understood each other carried a weight that words could not. They knew each other's pain. Shaq slowly pulled a new business contract from his jacket pocket. He clicked on his phone flashlight and aimed it at the signature line. He told Walter clearly that he had not come here to give away money. This was a business partnership. Shaq proposed forming a joint venture called the Clara and Shaq Bakery Shop. Delta Fuel Station would serve as the exclusive distribution point for the new brand. Shaq needed Walter to run operations at a fair and agreed monthly salary. Walter would be a full partner. The contract stated a royalty advance of $27,000 on signing. That amount was enough to cover Walter's land tax debt in full. This was a straight business deal between two men who respected each other. Walter would not be receiving charity. Walter took the contract in both hands and read every clause slowly and carefully. He could see the complete respect Shaq had put into protecting his dignity. There was no pity in any of it. Only a real and workable plan. Walter's voice trembled as he asked again to be sure. Shaq smiled warmly and confirmed that he genuinely needed Walter's help with this. The Clara brand needed a trustworthy, dependable person to manage the operation. Walter looked deep into the eyes of the giant man and felt the honesty in them. The old man gave a slow nod. Walter picked up an old ballpoint pen and signed his name under the word partner with a shaking hand. The pride of the old veteran had been protected completely. Shaq took the contract back, and something in his chest released. The knot was untied. Roy, the truck driver, and Miss Clara, standing quietly out on the porch, both let out a slow, relieved breath. They had watched everything. The kindness and the wisdom of the giant man had been something to see. The Delta Fuel Station did not feel cold and dark anymore. A light had come back on. Shaq explained the business model in plain, clear detail. He would invest in a modern display case installed inside the station. Miss Clara would handle baking fresh apple pies every morning. They would sell to students. LSU students would come from all over to pick up pastries at this spot. The combination of Shaq's name and Clara's baking would pull real traffic. Walter would oversee fuel deliveries and manage the storage yard. This was real work with real value. Walter looked at the revenue projections laid out clearly on the page. He could see that the plan was completely solid and workable. He no longer felt like a man being pitted. He was a real business partner. Shaq looked at the old pen Walter had used to sign. He said in a low, warm voice that this contract meant a great deal to his brand. Shaq's name needed an anchor location with real meaning and real history behind it. Walter had done more for him than he knew. Miss Clara stepped in from the doorway, her old eyes full of quiet joy. She wrapped her arms around Walter and turned to thank Shaq with everything she had. This joint venture had saved two working people at once. The rescue had arrived. The rain outside the station started to ease as the night wore on. The thunder had faded to a low, distant rumble from across the marsh. Shaq stood up, bent low through the doorway, and walked out to the rental car. Tomorrow would be the real fight. He told Walter to get a full night of sleep and come in ready. His legal team would be on site first thing in the morning. Walter stood on the porch and waved with a new steadiness in his eyes. He was not afraid anymore. The black SUV rolled down the foggy nighttime road back toward the motel. Shaq drove with his mind running through every legal step ahead. Everything had to be precise. There was no margin for error. Vanguard Energy believed that money could take anything it wanted. They did not know they were about to run into something stronger. The response from this quiet giant was going to hit hard. Sterling would not see it coming. Louisiana night settled into a deep stillness before the coming storm. The Delta Fuel Station stood alone under a faint moon. A fire had been lit inside that dark room. Justice would come in the morning. Monday morning, dawn broke over the Baton Rouge outskirts in a thin gray light. Cold marsh damp hung over the dried oil stains on the concrete. The clock read 8:45, and the air was already tight with tension. Engines growled in the distance. A shining black Cadillac led the enforcement convoy into the gravel lot. Sterling stepped out in his clean gray suit, and that same arrogant smile. Behind him came Clyde, the cold legal representative of the local bank. They brought heavy steel barriers. The work crew quickly moved to set up warning signs around the property line. Sterling tapped his alligator briefcase against the rusty iron railing of the station. He looked at Walter standing straight on the porch with open contempt. He was sure he had already won. Walter wore his old LSU windbreaker, both hands gripping the wooden railing. The sun-worn face of the old veteran was set hard, with extraordinary resolve. In his hand, he held the joint venture contract signed just the night before. He stood alone, but he did not flinch. Sterling smiled wide and demanded that Walter hand over the station property. He said the 9 o'clock foreclosure deadline had no exceptions for anyone. He called the contract in Walter's hand a worthless piece of paper. The bank only accepted cash. Clyde stepped forward and held out a sealed red-stamped document. He announced the outstanding debt of $27,345. If not paid immediately, Delta Fuel would transfer to Vanguard Energy right then. The air was almost impossible to breathe. Roy and Miss Clara positioned themselves in front of the main station door. They spread both arms wide to block the entrance and protect the old Delta sign. Sterling angrily ordered his enforcement crew to clear them out of the way. They were getting ready to move. Sterling knocked the toe of his polished leather shoe against the red brick step. He taunted Walter loudly and told him to call out the big guy so they could all get this over with. He mocked the idea that anyone could stop this from happening. Money this big always wins. Walter looked down at the joint venture contract in his thin palm. He said in a firm, flat voice that he believed in real justice. Even Clyde shifted slightly at the iron in the old man's voice. Walter was not giving an inch. Miss Clara gripped her empty pie basket and held her ground at the front step. She was not letting anyone step through that door to tear anything apart. Roy crossed his broad arms across his chest and planted his feet. They formed a wall of people. Then the sound of state patrol sirens cut through the highway air from a distance. A line of black SUVs swung into the gravel lot in close formation. Caleb stepped out of the lead vehicle with a thick case file held firmly in both hands. Help had arrived in time. 3 federal inspectors from the state highway and zoning department followed close behind Caleb. They moved quickly toward the county officer on site and presented their authorization. An emergency order from the state court required all activity to stop immediately. Sterling went pale. Caleb stated clearly that Vanguard Energy was under active criminal investigation. They had engaged in bribery of public officials to block the access lane. The fabricated traffic survey produced by Sterling had been fully exposed. The evidence was solid. Clyde went through the legal documents Caleb handed over with shaking hands. He immediately recalled the red-stamped foreclosure order and stepped back. The bank had no interest in becoming an accessory to a criminal case. Clyde moved fast to back away. Caleb produced a stamped bank wire confirmation. The full amount of $27,345 had been transferred. It was a lawful royalty advance from the Registered Bakery Partnership Company. The debt was cleared completely. Sterling collapsed where he stood. His face went gray and empty as old ash. The expensive alligator briefcase dropped from his hand and hit the concrete. He looked up in shaking disbelief at the giant man who had just stepped down from the black SUV. Shaquille O'Neal had just walked into the light. Shaq moved in his plain hoodie, stepping calmly in front of Sterling, without a single word of threat or violence. He did not raise a fist. He did not say anything at all. The 3 seconds of silence from that giant man pressed down like a physical force. Sterling's knees went soft. The convoy of black vehicles pulled into the gravel lot, and the sound filled the yard. Caleb stepped down and gave Walter a respectful nod. He immediately handed the zoning inspection file to the officers on site. Clyde was sweating now. 10 pages of documents laid out the full bribery network in clear detail. Sterling had personally signed off on the money transfer to the zoning employee. The transactions had taken place the previous April. The charge was financial fraud. State officers moved forward and secured the two enforcement workers on the spot. They told Sterling and Clyde to stay exactly where they were. The arrogance that had walked into this lot an hour ago had turned into pure fear. Sterling's face had no color left in it. Shaq stepped down from the black SUV, his hood pulled back slowly. His rough face showed no anger at all. He looked straight at Sterling and held 3 seconds of complete silence. The psychological pressure was enormous. Sterling stepped backward and stumbled over a piece of gravel, almost going down. He started to mumble something that sounded like it might become a plea. But Shaq gave him nothing, not a single word. The silence was its own verdict. Caleb smiled quietly and said that justice had been properly served. Vanguard Energy would be required to pay full damages to Walter. The illegal road divider would be removed immediately. The legal battle was won. Sterling and his enforcement crew scrambled to load up their equipment and clear out. The sleek Cadillac gunned its engine and drove away, leaving a trail of hot rubber smell and kicked-up dust. The arrogance of dirty money had been completely flattened. Vanguard had lost everything they came to take. 1 week later, Delta Fuel rang with the sounds of saws and hammers. Local tradespeople worked on the tin roof and rotted wood trim. The smell of fresh paint and lemon floor cleaner mixed in the air. The place was coming back to life. The illegally blocked left-turn lane was officially reopened. Cars and trucks turned in from the highway again the way they used to. The Delta Heritage Station, now Walter and Shaq's, had become a new gathering point. The whole town felt the lift. Miss Clara stood behind a bright new glass display case full of warm apple pies. Each golden pie smelled of cinnamon and rich butter and sold as fast as she could set them out. LSU students lined up all the way to the road to buy. Clara's pies sold out every single day. Walter wore a clean new work uniform and smiled and talked and moved with energy. The old man no longer carried the weight of unpaid bills or the threat of being taken out. The dignity of a working man had been kept completely whole. He was a proud manager now. Roy and the lumber drivers lifted cold drinks and laughed together on the porch. They celebrated the victory of justice and real human connection between people. The Delta station glowed under warm yellow neon. The place was full of warmth again. In the days that followed, the whole town showed up to help with the cleanup. Roy brought fresh pine planks from his haul. Miss Clara prepared food for all the workers on site. It felt like a community celebration. A new handcrafted sign went up on the wooden porch frame. Gold letters stood out on a clean pine board with a warm, fresh smell. The Delta Heritage Station, Walter and Shaq, had come back to life in full. People came from every direction to celebrate. The modern fuel pumps started working again in a steady rhythm. Walter stood at the entrance guiding customers in, with the widest smile he had worn in years. The old veteran had found the meaning of his days again. His pride was full and real. As the warm golden evening lights spread across the Baton Rouge outskirts, the crowd thinned out slowly and left the place quiet again. The smell of baked pie and lemon drifted easy in the cool evening breeze. The room felt truly peaceful. Shaq pulled a small wooden chair close to the porch and worked himself down into it. Walter sat across from him at the small round table, freshly wiped and clean. Neither one needed to fill the air with words. The silence said everything. The two men shared a slice of Miss Clara's apple pie together. Walter looked at his old student with eyes full of gratitude. Shaq smiled back softly, his wide chest rising and falling with quiet ease. He had paid the debt that mattered most. The memory of that cold 1991 winter had finally found its resting place. Walter was no longer alone in front of the ruthless greed of the world. The Delta fuel station would always be a place of shelter for the giant man. The journey was complete. Miss Clara pulled the front door softly closed behind her after clearing the last dish. Walter looked out at the old pine trees swaying under a sky full of stars. The fire of human kindness would keep burning in this place. The mission was done. The soft orange light of the Louisiana evening stretched long and warm across the outskirts. The laughter of children playing nearby drifted through the breeze. Shaq sat on the porch, his huge legs bent gently beneath him. He felt a real and quiet peace. Walter slid one of Clara's apple pies across the table toward him. The sweetness of cinnamon and rich warm butter came right off it. Shaq took a big bite and looked at his old friend. The old debt had been paid in full. His mother Lucille, somewhere beyond all of this, was certainly watching with pride. Shaq knew he had used his strength the right way. He had given back the honor that had once been given to him. The mission was complete and whole. Roy waved a long goodbye from the lot before heading out on his next long run. The old lumber truck engine roared once and pulled out onto the highway into the night. The Delta station burned bright under a full sky of stars. True happiness had come home. Walter looked at Shaq and said thank you from somewhere very deep inside. Shaq stayed quiet and held the old wrinkled hand in his. The peace of the soul is the most valuable thing in this life. The story ended beautifully.